Margot Thorne had learned that sanity in a place designed for madness was something you wore carefully, like a coat turned inside out. Show too little of it, and they increased your medication until your thoughts moved through syrup. Show too much, and they called it compensatory behavior. Added another diagnosis to your chart, extended your stay indefinitely. So she had become invisible. Not the kind of invisible that made people forget you existed, but the kind that made them forget to look closely. The fluorescent lights in Ward D hummed their eternal song, a sound Margot had stopped truly hearing sometime around her 18th year inside Pinecrest Psychiatric Hospital. The walls, once white, had mellowed to the color of old teeth. The linoleum floor had been mopped so many times that its pattern had worn into suggestion, a ghost of blue diamonds that nobody but Margot seemed to remember. She was 74 years old now. She had entered these walls at 42 with hair the color of wet earth and a spine that held itself straight with fury. Now her hair had surrendered to white, and her spine had learned the curvature of survival. But her eyes, pale gray like morning fog over the Oregon coast, remained exactly as sharp as they had been on the morning her children signed the papers that ended her freedom. The morning of January 14th, 1992, had started with coffee. Margot remembered this detail with a kind of precision that doctors found suspicious. They preferred their patients foggy, their memories unreliable, their timelines confused. But Margot had cataloged every moment of that morning because she understood, even then, that she was living the last day of her real life. The coffee had been weak. Marcus always made it too weak, but Margot had smiled and thanked him anyway, swallowing the bitter disappointment along with the watery brew. Her son had been 54 then, a man whose charm had always outpaced his character, whose smile promised things his actions never delivered. Her daughter Vivian was 56, a real estate agent with a husband who bought properties he couldn't afford, and a lifestyle that required constant financial maintenance. They had both come to the house that morning, the house Henry had built with his own hands over 4 summers in the 1950s, using timber he'd selected board by board, fitting joints so tight you couldn't slide paper between them. Henry had been dead for 11 days. Lung cancer had taken 6 months to finish what 40 years of sawdust had started, turning a man who could lift full sheets of plywood overhead into something that weighed less than a child by the end. Margot had held his hand as he slipped away, felt the exact moment his carpenter's fingers went slack, heard his final exhale like wind through empty rooms. She had promised him she would take care of everything, protect what they had built together, keep their home safe. She had tried. Marcus had done most of the talking that morning, as he always did. His voice carried that particular frequency of concern that people use when they want witnesses to remember how caring they seemed. Vivian had stood beside him, nodding at appropriate intervals, her face arranged in an expression Margot recognized from the mirror on mornings after Henry's diagnosis. Grief performing itself for an audience. The story they told was simple, elegant, and entirely false. Margot was confused lately, they said, forgetting things, talking to Henry as if he were still alive, getting angry when corrected, throwing dishes, threatening violence. They were worried, they said. They just wanted to help. This doctor, Dr. Sheffield Pembroke, was a friend of Marcus's from the country club. He specialized in grief counseling, in helping people transition after loss. He just wanted to talk, run a few tests, make sure Margot was processing Henry's death in healthy ways. Margot had gone willingly because she had no reason not to. Her children were worried. What mother wouldn't want to ease her children's concerns? What widow wouldn't accept help navigating the sharp edges of new grief? Dr. Pembroke's office had smelled like lemon furniture polish and old carpet. The chairs were leather, the desk mahogany, the diplomas on the wall impressive in their gilt frames. The doctor himself was thin, with thin lips and eyes that moved across forms without really seeing the person sitting across from him. His pen never stopped moving during their conversation, which lasted less than 50 minutes by the clock on his wall. The evaluation felt less like an examination and more like a predetermined conclusion searching for supporting evidence. Every answer Margot gave seemed to twist in the air between them, landing on his notepad as something entirely different from what she had said. When she explained that, yes, she sometimes spoke aloud to Henry's memory, found comfort in imagining his responses, Dr. Pembroke wrote something that made his lips press thinner. When she admitted that the house felt too large without him, that some mornings she woke forgetting he was gone and felt the grief crash over her again like drowning, he nodded in a way that suggested he was confirming suspicions rather than learning new information. The questions about Marcus and Vivian came near the end, casual but pointed. Did she trust them? Did she worry they wanted something from her? Had she accused them of having ulterior motives? Margot had answered honestly. She trusted them as much as any mother trusts adult children who have their own lives, their own problems, their own needs. She worried sometimes that Marcus's gambling had gotten worse, that the debts he thought Henry didn't know about had grown larger than he could manage. She knew Vivian's husband Douglas was ambitious, that his development projects required capital she suspected he didn't have. Dr. Pembroke's pen moved faster. Paranoid ideation regarding family members' financial motivations. Grandiose beliefs about ability to assess others' fiscal situations. Inappropriate suspicion of loved ones during vulnerable grief period. By noon, Margot was involuntarily committed to Pinecrest Psychiatric Hospital for a 72-hour evaluation. She never left. The first year had been the worst, though the word worst felt inadequate for what it actually was. Margot had screamed until her voice shredded. She had demanded lawyers, demanded to see a judge, demanded her rights under laws she had memorized from library books that orderlies brought to patients who begged. She had written letters, hundreds of letters, to courts and newspapers and advocacy groups and anyone who might listen. None of the letters ever left the facility. The nurses said they had been mailed. Margot knew they were lying because replies never came, because nothing ever changed, because the system had swallowed her whole, and nobody outside seemed to notice. Dr. Pembroke visited monthly at first, always with the same thin smile, always adjusting her medication based on her continued resistance to treatment. Margot learned quickly that resistance meant sedation, that fighting meant losing more of herself to the chemical fog they pumped into her system through pills and injections and IV drips that left her too heavy to lift her own arms. So she had learned to perform. She learned to take pills under the watchful eyes of nurses, then later, in her room, retrieve them from beneath her tongue and hide them in the hollow leg of her metal bed frame. She learned which staff members could be trusted with small kindnesses, and which ones reported every deviation to supervisors looking for reasons to extend commitments, increase dosages, make examples of patients who thought they could outsmart the system. She learned to recite the responses they wanted to hear. Understanding came slowly, the way she imagined understanding came to prisoners, realizing their sentences would never actually end. Her children visited once, 3 months after her commitment. They came to have her sign papers. Power of attorney, they said, just temporary, just so they could manage her affairs while she recovered. Just to make sure bills got paid, property got maintained, everything she and Henry had built stayed safe until she was well enough to come home. Margot had refused. She held the pen in her hand, looked into Vivian's eyes, saw something there that made her blood run cold. Understanding crystallized in that moment, like frost forming on glass. This was not temporary. This was not about her recovery. This was about the house on Ridgeway Avenue, about the land Henry had bought in 1950 when Millbrook was still small enough that 5 acres cost less than a used car. This was about Marcus's debts and Vivian's husband's ambitions and the simple, terrible math of inheritance. Her refusal had been quiet but absolute. Vivian's face had flickered, not with guilt, but with annoyance, the irritation of someone whose convenience had been disrupted by an uncooperative obstacle. Marcus had tried reasoning, then pleading, then anger. Finally, they left with unsigned papers and expressions that told Margot everything she needed to know about her future. They never came back. 32 years was long enough to learn every crack in every ceiling tile, every pattern in water stains that bloomed and faded with seasons, every variation in the fluorescent hum that marked different times of day. Margot knew which orderly unlocked the supply closet at 6:47 each morning and forgot to check that it latched behind him. She knew the security camera in the East Corridor had a blind spot near the fire exit, a shadow approximately 3 feet wide where a person could stand unobserved, invisible to whoever monitored the feeds from the security office in the building's north wing. She knew that on rainy nights, the night shift nurses congregated in the staff lounge to watch television, leaving hallways monitored only by occasional rounds that followed predictable patterns. She knew these things not because she had been planning escape, not actively, not for most of those years. She knew them because paying attention was the only power she had left. In a place that had stripped her of name, of autonomy, of everything that made her Margot Thorne rather than patient 6847, observation was resistance. Knowing was surviving. But something changed in her 67th month of captivity. 2 nurses talking in the hallway outside her room, their voices carrying the particular carelessness of people who believed their patients were too medicated or too broken to process what they heard. Margot kept her eyes closed, her breathing steady, playing the role of the sleeping patient so thoroughly that she had almost convinced herself. The conversation was about county audits, about liability reviews, about properties tied to long-term patients who had never been properly processed through whatever bureaucratic machinery was supposed to handle estates when people disappeared into institutions. Someone had noticed. Someone at the county recorder's office had caught irregularities during a routine review. There were properties, the nurse said, still listed under names of patients who had been committed decades ago. Properties that should have been transferred or sold or dealt with somehow. Properties that existed in legal limbo because the system had simply forgotten they were there. The old woman in 6847, the nurse said, been here since the first Bush administration. Apparently there was property still under her name. County had flagged it, probably worth a fortune now, especially with all the development happening on the ridge above town. The second nurse had laughed. Good luck getting her to sign anything, she said. That one's sharp. Too sharp if you asked her, which nobody did because nurses' observations about patient competency only mattered when they aligned with doctors' diagnoses. Their footsteps had receded down the hall, leaving Margot alone with her accelerating heartbeat and a single clarifying thought that cut through decades of resignation like Henry saw through pine. The house was still hers. Somehow, impossibly, after 32 years of Marcus and Vivian trying to take it, the house on Ridgeway Avenue remained legally in her name. For months after that overheard conversation, Margot allowed herself to hope, then punished herself for hoping. She was 73 years old then. Her body had spent 3 decades being slowly poisoned by medications she didn't need, housed in rooms without sufficient sunlight, fed institutional food designed for cost rather than nutrition. Marcus would be 70 now, Vivian 72, presumably living whatever lives they had built on the foundation of her suffering. Dr. Pembroke would be retired, perhaps dead. What could she possibly do with this information except torture herself with it? But hope, once planted, grew stubborn as dandelions in sidewalk cracks. She began collecting details with renewed purpose. She learned that the property audit the nurse had mentioned was ongoing, that bureaucracies moved with glacial patience, especially when money was involved, that nobody at the county level seemed particularly motivated to resolve the situation quickly. She learned that the house had indeed never been transferred, that documents her children had attempted to file years ago had been rejected due to inconsistencies in notarization, that the property had sat in a kind of legal limbo ever since, abandoned but not ownerless, rotting but not surrendered. She learned, in fragments gathered over months of careful listening, that someone at the county level was asking questions. Questions about how a woman could be committed for 32 years without proper hearings. Questions about who had signed the original commitment papers. Questions about Dr. Sheffield Pembroke, whose signature appeared on hundreds of dubious commitment orders across 3 decades, many of them connected to patients who had mysteriously signed away valuable properties shortly after admission. Someone was finally looking, but Margot had spent too long in Pinecrest to trust that justice would find her on its own. Justice required advocates, and she had none. Justice required evidence, and everything she knew was locked inside her head. Inadmissible testimony from a woman the system had already decided was insane. If she wanted justice, she would have to reach out and take it herself. And to do that, she would have to get out. The plan took shape slowly, like water wearing away stone grain by grain, year by year, until suddenly there was a canyon where solid rock had been. First, the uniform. Maintenance staff wore gray coveralls that patients were forbidden to touch, but the supply closet with its faulty latch contained extras for new hires. Margot had 47 seconds by her count between when Henry, the morning orderly, opened the closet and when the latch finally caught. 47 seconds to cross 12 feet of hallway, reach the third shelf, secure a coverall in her size, and return to her room undetected. She practiced the route in her mind for 2 months before she attempted it, memorizing the number of steps, the angle of approach that kept her in the camera's blind spot, the exact pressure needed on the closet door to prevent it from squeaking. When she finally made the attempt, on a Wednesday morning in April, while Henry was distracted by a patient having a seizure 2 rooms down, the entire operation took 41 seconds. She was back in her room, coverall rolled tight beneath her extra blanket, before Henry finished administering emergency medication. Second, the timing. Friday nights were quietest. Day shift eager to leave, night shift minimal. Administrative staff who might notice irregularities gone for hours. More importantly, Friday nights brought nurse Deborah Kerrigan, a kind woman in her 50s who Margot had cultivated carefully over years of small conversations, expressions of gratitude for minor kindnesses, genuine interest in the struggles of Deborah's life beyond these walls. Deborah's husband was ill with Parkinson's. Deborah was tired in ways that went beyond physical exhaustion. Deborah occasionally fell asleep in the staff lounge during her rounds between midnight and 3, especially on nights when her husband had been particularly difficult to manage. Third, the route. The fire exit in the east corridor led to a loading dock used for medical supply deliveries. The dock was monitored by a camera, but the camera had a blind spot that Margot had tested dozens of times during permitted walks through the facility, shuffling past in her patient uniform while noting exactly where the lens failed to capture movement. From the dock, a drainage ditch ran alongside the property fence line, eventually connecting to the culvert that emptied near Highway 22. From the highway, if the bus routes hadn't changed in 32 years, and she had no reason to believe they had, because bureaucracies in places like Millbrook moved with the speed of continental drift, she could reach downtown in 3 transfers in approximately 4 hours. She had $127 hidden in her mattress, accumulated over 3 decades from Christmas cards sent by her cousin Edith, who lived in Seattle, and apparently had never gotten the memo that the family crazy had been locked away. The cards always contained crisp $20 bills and notes hoping Margot was well, hoping they could visit soon, hoping things would get better. Edith had visited once, in 1997, and been told by staff that Margot was having a difficult day, that visits upset her, that perhaps it was better if family stayed away. Edith had never come back, but the cards kept arriving every December like clockwork, like proof that someone outside these walls remembered she existed. $127 was enough for bus fare, enough to survive for a few days if she was careful, enough to buy breathing room while she figured out what came next. It would have to be. The final element was the most uncertain, the variable that could undo everything no matter how carefully she planned. Her body. 74 years of age, 32 years of institutional food and sedentary existence, 3 decades of medications that had wreaked havoc on bones and muscles and joints. Could she walk the distance required? Could she climb down from the loading dock? Could she run if necessary, fight if cornered, survive exposure to October rain if shelter proved elusive? Margot didn't know, but she knew that if she didn't try soon, she wouldn't be able to try at all. The body had its own timeline, its own deadline that approached whether she was ready or not. The night she chose was Friday, October 18th, 2024. Rain had been falling since noon, not a deluge, but steady, soaking rain that sent outdoor staff inside and kept residents subdued in their rooms, staring at walls or televisions or nothing at all. The kind of rain that made people look at floors rather than faces, that provided cover for the invisible to become even more so. Margot ate her dinner with usual calm, the mystery meat and instant potatoes and vegetable medley that tasted like nothing because institutional kitchens had long ago learned that flavor inspired complaints, while blandness inspired resignation. She submitted to the evening medication round, palming the pills with practiced ease that came from 10,000 repetitions, waiting until Nurse Jameson's cart rattled to the next room before spitting them into her hand and adding them to the collection in her bed frame's hollow leg. She watched the last of daylight fade through the barred window of her room, and she thought about Henry. He had been dead for 32 years, longer now than they had been married, but she still remembered his hands, rough from wood and varnish, gentle when they touched her face. She remembered the way he had laughed when she said something clever, his eyes crinkling at the corners, his whole body shaking with genuine delight. She remembered the way he had held her during the hard years when babies wouldn't come, when month after month brought disappointment instead of the family they both wanted. And then finally, miraculously, Marcus had arrived, followed 2 years later by Vivian. Henry had seen something wrong in them even when they were young. Not wrong exactly, but absent. Some essential quality of empathy or honor or simple human decency that most people carried as naturally as breathing. He had tried to tell her gently in the years before his heart gave out, tried to warn her without quite saying the words that would make his fears real. "Keep an eye on them," he had said near the end. "They're our blood, but they're not our heart. Watch them close." She hadn't listened. She hadn't wanted to believe that the children she had carried and birthed and raised could be capable of what Henry suspected. But Henry, in his carpenter's way, had prepared for what he couldn't prevent. He had built hiding places into the house on Ridgeway Avenue, had squirreled away evidence and insurance and protections against the future he feared was coming. He had done what he could to save her, even knowing he wouldn't be there to see whether his preparations were sufficient. At 11:47, Margot Thorne rose from her bed for the last time. She moved carefully, listening for footsteps in the corridor, for the squeaking wheels of medication carts, for any sound that suggested someone might be watching. The facility was quiet, but not silent. Televisions murmured behind closed doors. Somewhere on a different ward, a patient cried out in sleep or memory or madness. The fluorescent lights hummed their eternal song, the only constant in a place where time moved differently than it did outside. She crossed to her bed frame and retrieved the stolen coverall from where she had hidden it weeks ago, wrapped in her extra blanket in a way that suggested lumpy bedding rather than contraband. Gray and shapeless, it swallowed her thin frame when she pulled it on over her institutional pajamas, but it would serve. She pulled her white hair back with a rubber band she had saved from a newspaper delivery months ago, back when newspapers were still permitted before some administrator had decided that current events were too stimulating for patients who needed to focus on healing rather than the world outside. She tucked her hair under a cap she had fashioned from a spare pillowcase, cutting and folding until it resembled something a maintenance worker might wear. In the dim light from the hallway, she looked less like a patient and more like a tired worker heading home late. Someone forgettable. Someone who belonged in the spaces between visibility and notice. She didn't look back at her room. There was nothing there worth remembering except the decades it had stolen from her, and she was done letting this place take anything more. The corridor was empty. Margot's soft-soled slippers made almost no sound on the linoleum as she walked with purpose, not hurried but not hesitant, the steady pace of someone who had somewhere to be and every right to be going there. She had learned years ago that walking like you belong somewhere was often enough to convince others you did, that confidence was its own kind of camouflage. The supply closet door was closed. The east corridor camera was pointing north, as it always did, capturing the nurse's station and the main hallway, but missing the alcove where the fire exit waited. The staff lounge door was shut, but through its window, Margot could see the blue glow of television, could see Deborah's head tilted back against her chair, eyes closed, exhausted from whatever her evening had been before she arrived for her shift. The fire exit was 12 steps away. Margot counted them, each one carrying her farther from safety and closer to whatever waited beyond these walls. 10 steps, 7 steps, 5 steps. Her hand closed around the release bar, cold metal against her palm, solid and real in a way that nothing in Pinecrest ever felt. The mechanism was supposed to trigger an alarm. Maintenance had been complaining for months about the faulty sensor, about budget cuts that meant repairs got postponed indefinitely, about how eventually someone was going to have an actual emergency and the alarm wouldn't sound, and then administration would care, but by then it would be too late. Margot had listened to these complaints the way she listened to everything, filing information away against future need. She pressed down. The release bar moved with surprising ease. The door opened with a whisper of cold air and rain, with the smell of freedom and wet asphalt and the world beyond these walls. For one endless moment, Margot stood on the threshold between the only world she had known for 32 years and the darkness beyond. Rain falling on her face for the first time since 1992. Real rain from a real sky, not the filtered air of Ward D, but actual weather falling from an actual atmosphere that stretched up into space and down to the distant curve of Earth. She stepped through. The door closed behind her with a soft click that sounded to Margot like the most important sound she had ever heard. The sound of before becoming after, of captivity becoming possibility. The loading dock was slick with rain, but the railing held as Margot lowered herself down to the drainage ditch below. Her bones protested. Joints that had spent 3 decades moving only in prescribed patterns suddenly asked to perform actions they had almost forgotten. Her lungs, weakened by years of stale institutional air, burned with the effort of controlled breathing. But she kept moving, one foot and then the next, because stopping meant being caught, and being caught meant going back, and going back meant dying in Ward D without ever knowing whether Henry's preparations had been enough. The ditch ran alongside the property exactly as she remembered from the one time, early in her commitment, when they had taken her outside for what they called recreational therapy. The darkness swallowed her as completely as she had hoped, rain washing away any scent the dogs might follow when they eventually realized patient 6847 was missing. By the time anyone noticed, Margot would be gone. But the real question, the one that had sustained her through 32 years of captivity and would sustain her through whatever came next, remained unanswered. What was waiting for her inside the house on Ridgeway Avenue, inside the home that impossibly still bore her name? What had Henry hidden? What had he known? And would it be enough to reclaim not just property, but the life that had been stolen, the years that could never be returned, the justice that seemed as distant as stars? The drainage ditch ended at a chain-link fence that separated Pinecrest grounds from the service road beyond. Margot had known about the fence, had seen it from windows during her permitted outdoor time years ago, when such things were still allowed. But knowing about something from a distance and confronting it with a 74-year-old body were different matters entirely. The rain had soaked through her stolen coverall within minutes of leaving the building. Her fingers, stiff with cold and age, found the chain link and held on while she assessed the obstacle. The fence was perhaps 6 feet tall, topped with a curl of wire that wasn't quite barbed but wasn't friendly either. In another life, in her real life when she was 42, and healthy and strong from years of working alongside Henry in his workshop, she might have laughed at the idea of climbing it. But Margot Thorne had not survived 32 years in Pinecrest by accepting limitations imposed by reasonable assessment of her capabilities. She followed the fence line for perhaps 100 yards, slippers squelching in mud, until she found what she had been hoping for. A section where ground erosion had created a gap beneath the fence, maybe 18 inches of space between earth and metal. Not much, but enough. Getting down was easier than she expected, her body remembering how to lower itself to ground level even after all these years. Getting through was agony. The mud was cold and thick and smelled of rot and rain. The bottom edge of the fence caught her coverall, tore it, scraped along her back as she army crawled through the gap like a soldier in some war she had never signed up to fight. By the time she emerged on the other side, she was shaking from cold, from exertion, from the sheer, overwhelming reality of what she was doing. She was outside, actually outside, beyond the fence, beyond the grounds, beyond Pinecrest's reach for the first time in 32 years. For a moment, Margot simply lay in the mud and let the rain fall on her face. The sky above was black and starless, choked with clouds, but it was sky, real sky, stretching forever in every direction, unbroken by bars or wire-reinforced glass, or the architectural grammar of institutional control. She could smell earth and wet leaves and car exhaust from somewhere distant, ordinary smells of a world that had continued turning without her, that had moved on and changed and become something different during the decades of her absence. Then she heard the dogs, German shepherds. Pinecrest kept them for security, though Margot had only ever seen them from a distance during facility lockdown drills that practiced scenarios everyone knew would never actually happen, because patients in places like this didn't escape. They just faded slowly into furniture and floor and walls until they were gone. Now the dog's barking cut through the rain, sharp and urgent, and she understood that her absence had been discovered sooner than she had hoped. She forced herself up. Her back screamed where the fence had torn it, and her left knee, always weak, weaker now, threatened to buckle. But she moved, one foot and then the next, following the service road toward the distant glow of Highway 22's streetlights. The dog's barking faded as she walked, either because they hadn't picked up her trail yet, or because the rain was washing her scent away as quickly as she left it. Either way, she kept moving. The bus shelter on Highway 22 was a concrete slab with a rusted metal roof, illuminated by a single flickering light that attracted moths despite the rain. Margot collapsed onto the bench and allowed herself 60 seconds of rest, counting them off in her head because counting had been one of her survival tools in the ward. A way to structure time when time had lost all meaning, when days bled into months, bled into years, until the only way to know how long she had been gone was to count backward from now until then and hope the math still worked. At 57 seconds, headlights appeared in the distance. She tensed, prepared to run if necessary, though where she would run to and whether her body would cooperate remained open questions. But the vehicle that emerged from the rain wasn't a Pinecrest security car or a police cruiser. It was a bus, a public transit bus with destination signs reading Millbrook Central via County Line. The same route she had taken 3 decades ago when the world was different and she was free. The bus hissed to a stop and the doors folded open. Margot climbed aboard as if she had done it yesterday instead of 32 years ago, as if she were just another passenger on a late-night route instead of an escaped psychiatric patient covered in mud and running from dogs that might still be following. The driver was a heavy-set woman with tired eyes and a name tag reading Dolores Kimball. She looked at Margot, took in the mud-streaked face and rain-soaked coverall and torn clothing, took in the obvious signs of someone having a very bad night, and raised one eyebrow in a gesture that contained multitudes of questions she chose not to ask. "Rough night, honey?" The words came out rusty, Margot's voice unused to speaking above the institutional murmur she had cultivated for 3 decades. "You have no idea." She fumbled in the coverall's pocket for the money she had hidden there. Bills soft with age. Coins that might not even be in circulation anymore. "How much to Millbrook?" Dolores studied her for a long moment. Eleanor waited for the questions, for the suspicion, for the call to authorities that would end everything before it began. Instead, Dolores shook her head and waved toward the seats. "Get out of the rain, honey. We'll worry about fare later." Margot sank into a seat near the back and watched the lights of Pinecrest disappear behind her through rain-streaked windows. The bus was nearly empty, just 2 other passengers, a young man with earbuds who never looked up from his phone, and an elderly woman with shopping bags who dozed against the window. For the first time in 32 years, Margot was surrounded by people who had no idea who she was. No chart followed her here. No diagnosis preceded her. She was just another tired passenger on a late-night bus, anonymous and ordinary and free in ways that had nothing to do with legal status and everything to do with being unknown. She began to cry silently, without drama, just tears tracking down her mud-streaked face, while the bus carried her toward the home she had been stolen from 3 decades ago. The journey took longer than Margot remembered, or perhaps her memory of Millbrook's distance from the facility had simply eroded over years of having nowhere to go and no reason to measure distance in practical terms. The bus stopped at stations she didn't recognize, in neighborhoods that had been fields when she last saw them. Shopping centers had sprung up where farms once stood. Roads had been widened, renamed, rerouted through landscape that seemed familiar and foreign simultaneously, like looking at your own face after decades without mirrors and finding a stranger staring back. But some things remained. When the bus finally turned onto the old county road that led into Millbrook proper, Margot felt her heart squeeze in recognition. There was Henderson's farm, smaller now, the old barn replaced with something prefabricated and industrial, but the stone wall along the road was the same wall she had driven past 1,000 times. There was the Methodist church, its white steeple visible even through the rain, its parking lot empty at this hour, but still radiating the kind of permanence that small-town institutions carried like birthright. There was the elementary school where Marcus and Vivian had learned to read, to write, to become the strangers who would eventually betray her. Millbrook Central. Dolores announced it without ceremony, her voice carrying the flatness of someone who had said these words 10,000 times and would say them 10,000 more. End of the line, folks. Margot rose on unsteady legs. When she passed the driver's seat, she pressed several bills into Dolores's hand. More than the fare, probably, but it was the least she could offer this woman who had asked no questions and demanded no explanations. "Thank you for the kindness." Dolores looked at the money, then at Margot's face, and something in her expression softened into recognition of a kind Margot couldn't quite name. "You be careful out there, honey. Whatever you're running from or running to, I hope you find what you're looking for." Margot stepped off the bus into the rain-washed streets of the town that had once been her home and now felt like a museum of her previous life, preserved but no longer living, familiar but fundamentally changed in ways she was only beginning to understand. Ridgeway Avenue was a 20-minute walk from the bus station if you were healthy and the weather was good. Tonight, in the rain, with a body weakened by 32 years of institutional neglect and injuries from her escape that were beginning to announce themselves with increasing urgency, it took Margot nearly an hour. She stopped twice to rest. sheltering under awnings of businesses that hadn't existed when she was last free. A coffee shop where the hardware store used to be, all exposed brick and Edison bulbs, and chalkboard menus listing drinks that cost more than she remembered paying for entire meals. A yoga studio in what had been the Five and Dime, its windows displaying bodies bent into shapes that looked like suffering packaged as wellness. The town had changed in ways both superficial and fundamental, growing unfamiliar even as its bones remained recognizable underneath. But Ridgeway Avenue, when she finally reached it, was exactly as she remembered. The old oak trees still lined the sidewalk, their branches arching overhead to create a tunnel that would be glorious in autumn when leaves turned colors that October rain hadn't yet stripped away. The streetlights were the same vintage style the town council had installed in 1978 after months of debate about historical character versus modern efficiency. The houses were the same Victorian and colonial revival styles that had defined the neighborhood since its construction in the early 1900s, though some had been painted new colors, renovated, updated for contemporary living, with additions that disrupted original proportions in ways Henry would have found offensive. All except one. The house at 1847 Ridgeway Avenue stood at the end of the block, set back from the road behind a yard that had become wilderness. The white paint Henry had so carefully maintained, applying fresh coats every 5 years like clockwork, had faded to gray and peeled away in long strips that exposed weathered wood beneath. The shutters hung at angles, some missing entirely, their hardware rusted beyond function. The porch roof sagged where a support beam had given way, probably years ago, and the front steps where Margot had sat with Henry on summer evenings, watching fireflies and talking about nothing important, had collapsed into a heap of rotted lumber. The windows were dark, some broken, covered with plywood or plastic sheeting that had itself deteriorated over years of weather. The chimney leaned slightly, mortar having worked loose from freeze-thaw cycles that nobody had been there to repair. The roof showed patches of exposed underlayment where shingles had blown away and never been replaced. It looked like a corpse, like something that had died slowly while the world moved on around it, forgotten by everyone except the woman who had once called it home. Margot stood at the edge of the overgrown yard for a long time, rain falling around her, the first gray suggestion of dawn beginning to lighten the eastern sky. She had perhaps an hour before the neighborhood woke, before early risers emerged to collect newspapers that probably didn't exist anymore in the way she remembered, before someone noticed a strange old woman standing in the street, staring at the abandoned property that had been a local curiosity for decades. This was the house where she had raised her children, where she had loved her husband for 42 years, where she had nursed him through his final illness and held his hand as he slipped away and promised him she would take care of everything. This was the house where her children had come after his funeral with their calculators and their appraisers, already dividing up a life that wasn't finished yet. This was the house where she had been stolen from herself on a January morning that felt simultaneously like yesterday and like something that had happened to someone else entirely. A light came on in the house next door, in what had been Wally Brenner's place, though he was probably dead or gone by now, replaced by strangers who had heard stories about the crazy woman who used to live at 1847 and avoided the property like it might be contagious. Margot forced her legs to move, carrying her through the gap in the rusted fence, through weeds that reached her waist and scratched at her torn coverall, up to the side of the house where the kitchen door had always stuck in wet weather and never quite locked properly despite Henry's best efforts to plane it true. The door was still there, though the screen that had covered it was long gone. Margot tried the handle, rusted and resistant, but it turned. The wood of the frame had swollen and warped over years of neglect, and she had to put her shoulder into it, had to push with strength she didn't know she still possessed. But the door gave way with a groan of protest and swung inward into darkness that smelled like everything she had lost. The smell hit her first, before her eyes adjusted to the dimness, mildew and rot, and the dusty, layered scent of decades of abandonment. But beneath it, fainter, the ghost of something else. Lemon polish, maybe, or the herbs she used to hang in bundles from the kitchen ceiling, or simply the accumulated residue of 42 years of life lived in these rooms. The smell of her own history, preserved like specimens under glass. The kitchen was destroyed, though destroyed implied agency that this decay lacked. Not by time alone, though time had certainly done its work. Someone had been here over the years, vandals probably, or squatters seeking shelter, or teenagers looking for thrills in the local haunted house. The cabinets hung open, their contents long since removed or scattered across floors thick with debris. The refrigerator stood with its door ajar, interior black with mold that had probably been growing since the power was cut sometime in the mid-90s. The window over the sink was broken, and leaves had blown in to form a carpet of decay on linoleum that was the same pattern Margot remembered choosing from samples at the hardware store in 1968. But the bones were still there, the cabinets Henry had built by hand, with their carefully routed edges and solid maple frames that would outlast whatever cheap replacements modern contractors installed. The tin ceiling he had restored when they first moved in, now stained with water damage but still bearing its original pressed pattern of flowers and vines. The breakfast nook where Vivian had done her homework and Marcus had announced his engagement to the first of what would be 3 wives, where Margot had sat alone after Henry's funeral and wondered how she would survive without him. She had survived, just not in the way she had imagined, not in the way anyone should have to survive. Margot moved through the kitchen into the hallway, her hand trailing along the wall for support because the adrenaline that had carried her through escape was beginning to wear off, and the injuries she had sustained were making themselves known with increasing insistence. The wallpaper she had chosen in 1972, a subtle pattern of blue hydrangeas that Henry had helped her hang over a long weekend in July, had peeled away in sheets, revealing older paper beneath it, a yellow floral pattern that had been there when they bought the house and that they had covered because Margot found it too busy, too insistent in its cheerfulness. Layers of history exposed by decay, layers of time made visible through destruction. The living room was worse than the kitchen, if worse was even the right word for what had happened here. The ceiling had partially collapsed, exposing the attic space above and allowing rain to damage everything below. The furniture was gone, taken probably by her children after they failed to secure the deed, or looted by others over the years when it became clear nobody was coming back to claim what remained. Only the built-in bookshelves survived, empty now, their wood warped and stained, but still standing where Henry had installed them to frame the fireplace, where he had fitted them with such precision that they looked like they had grown there rather than been constructed. Margot's breath caught. She crossed the room, debris crunching under her soaked slippers, and knelt before the bookshelves, despite the protest from knees that hadn't knelt in 3 decades. Her fingers found the 3rd shelf from the bottom, the panel that had always looked like solid backing but wasn't. The secret Henry had shown her one night after the children had moved out, and the house was just theirs again. Just 2 people growing old together in rooms built for family. She pressed the sequence he had taught her. Left corner, right corner, center, hold for 3 seconds. The mechanism released with a click that sounded impossibly loud in the empty house, and the panel swung open to reveal the space Henry had hidden there. 2 feet wide and 18 inches deep, a cavity between walls that shouldn't have existed according to the house's blueprints, but did because Henry had built this place and knew where exceptions could be carved from structure without compromising integrity. Inside was a metal lockbox, its surface dulled by time but otherwise intact. Beside it, wrapped in plastic that had miraculously kept moisture out, was a large manila envelope, and beneath both, a cassette tape in a clear case, the kind people used for recording voice memos before digital age made such things obsolete. Margot's hands shook as she reached for them. Henry had known. Somehow, impossibly, Henry had known that someone would try to take what was hers, that the children they had raised together had inherited something other than the values they had tried to instill. He had prepared for betrayal even while hoping it wouldn't come, had built insurance against futures he prayed wouldn't materialize, but understood were possible because he had seen something in Marcus's eyes, something in Vivian's calculations, something that told him love alone wasn't enough to guarantee loyalty. She pulled the envelope out first, tearing away plastic that crackled and split after decades of protection. Inside were documents. Even in the dim light filtering through broken windows, she could see official letterhead, notarized stamps, dates and signatures in Henry's careful hand that had become increasingly shaky in his final months as cancer ate away at everything except his determination to protect her. The first page was a property deed, not a copy, not something obtained from county records, but the original deed to 1847 Ridgeway Avenue, recorded in 1950, listing Henry James Thorne and Margot Ann Thorne as joint tenants with right of survivorship. The original signatures, the original notarization, the original recording stamps that proved ownership in ways that couldn't be disputed or forged or explained away. The second page was a letter, and Margot's vision blurred as she read Henry's handwriting, familiar even after all these years, recognizable even through the shakiness that cancer had imposed on hands that had once worked wood with such precision. My dearest Margot, the words swam through her tears. If you're reading this, I wasn't wrong about them. I'm sorry, I hoped I was paranoid, that my suspicions about Marcus's gambling debts and Vivian's husband's schemes were just a dying man's worries seeing darkness where there was only shadow. But I've seen how they look at this house, how they calculate its value like it's just another number on a spreadsheet instead of 42 years of our lives. Instead of the place where we raised them and loved them and believed they would become better than they were. Everything you need is here. The deed to prove ownership that predates anything they might have filed. Financial records showing every dollar that flowed in and out of our household going back to 1950. Cross-referenced with dates and amounts that will reveal what I know about Marcus's borrowing. About the money he took from my business accounts, thinking I was too sick to notice. Recordings of conversations I had with Marcus in my final months. He didn't know I was taping, which might make them inadmissible in court, but they'll show anyone who listens exactly what kind of man our son became, exactly what he was willing to do to secure what he thought was his inheritance. And Margot, there's a letter from Dr. Pembroke. Marcus left it here by mistake after one of his visits in my final weeks. He was careless because he thought I was too far gone to understand what I was seeing. It talks about arrangements and considerations and financial agreements. I don't know exactly what it means, but I know it's not right. I know it's evidence of something that shouldn't be happening. I love you, Margot. I've loved you since I was 24 years old, and you walked into my father's workshop looking for someone to fix a broken chair, and I knew immediately that I was looking at the rest of my life. I'm sorry I couldn't protect you better. I'm sorry I'm leaving you alone with whatever comes next. But maybe this will help. Maybe this will be enough. Always yours, Henry. The letter was dated July 1991, 6 months before Henry's death in January 1992. 6 months before Margot's commitment to Pinecrest. He had known even then, had spent his final months preparing this arsenal while she had been focused on his comfort, on managing his pain, on being present for every moment they had left together. Margot set the letter aside with trembling hands and opened the lockbox. Inside was cash, bundled and old, but still legal tender because American currency didn't expire the way love did, didn't decay the way bodies did, just persisted in its value regardless of whose hands held it. Hundreds, maybe dozens of them, enough to buy breathing room and time and resources for whatever battle was coming. There were photographs too, old ones with edges curled by age, showing Marcus and Vivian as children before whatever had gone wrong with them went wrong. Baby pictures and school photos, and holiday snapshots that documented the years when Margot had still believed her children would grow into the kind of adults Henry had been, the kind of person she tried to be. And one photograph that made her throat close. Herself and Henry on their wedding day in 1950, young and hopeful and completely unaware of what the future held, dressed in their best clothes, which weren't much because they didn't have much back then, standing in front of the courthouse because church weddings cost money they didn't have, and didn't need to make the promises they were making to each other. But it was the final item that made Margot's hands freeze, that made her breath stop in her chest. A letter on Pinecrest Psychiatric Hospital letterhead, addressed to Marcus Thorne, dated December 28, 1991, 2 weeks before Margot's commitment. Marcus. The handwriting was neat, professional, utterly damning in its casualness. Per our agreement, I've reviewed the documentation you provided regarding your mother's alleged symptoms. I want to be clear that what you're describing does not constitute grounds for involuntary commitment under standard diagnostic criteria. A woman grieving her husband of 42 years does not automatically qualify for psychiatric hospitalization simply because her grief is profound. However, given the circumstances you've outlined and the financial consideration we discussed during our meeting at the country club, I am prepared to conduct an evaluation that will support your petition for commitment. I believe we can frame her grief responses as indicators of more serious underlying pathology that warrants long-term residential treatment. The fee we agreed upon, $15,000, should be delivered before the evaluation date in cash, as discussed. Once the commitment is finalized and becomes permanent rather than temporary, I will expect the second payment of $35,000, also in cash, deposited in the account we established for such arrangements. Please ensure your sister is present during the evaluation to corroborate your account of your mother's behavior. Consistency in family testimony is essential for the paperwork to hold up under review. I suggest you both describe specific incidents of paranoid ideation, particularly regarding financial matters. Any claims she makes that family members want her property for themselves should be documented as delusional thinking. I trust this will resolve your concerns about the property situation and allow you and your sister to move forward with the plans you described. As always, I appreciate your discretion in these matters. The signature was Sheffield Pembroke's, MD, followed by his medical license number and a stamp that made the whole thing official, that transformed conspiracy into documentation, that turned betrayal into policy. Margot read the letter 3 times, her vision blurring from tears or shock or rage, or some combination of all three that made it hard to separate individual emotions from the overwhelming tide of understanding that crashed over her. There it was, proof written in black and white, undeniable and complete. Her children had paid a doctor $15,000 to diagnose her as mentally ill, had paid another $35,000 once the commitment became permanent, had planned it, discussed fees, arranged details, coordinated their testimony like actors rehearsing a play where the script called for their mother to disappear. 32 years of her life, purchased for $50,000 total. 32 years of captivity, of chemical fog, of being told her memories were delusions and her protests were symptoms. All of it bought and paid for like any other business transaction. The sun was rising now, pale light filtering through the broken windows, illuminating the ruin of everything she had called home. Margot sat on the floor of her destroyed living room, surrounded by water damage and debris, holding evidence that could set her free, or at least prove that she had never deserved to be caged in the first place. She didn't know what to do next. She was 74 years old, exhausted beyond anything she had words for, injured in ways she was only beginning to catalog, soaked to the bone in a house that wasn't safe for habitation. The authorities were surely looking for her by now. She had no identification beyond institutional badges that marked her as escaped patient rather than free citizen. She had no resources beyond the cash Henry had left and the documents in her hands. She had no allies in a world that had moved on without her for 3 decades. But she had proof, and she had a name, Dr. Sheffield Pembroke, and she had 32 years of rage, carefully banked, waiting for exactly this moment. Footsteps on the porch made her tense, made her shove the documents back into the envelope and the envelope into the lockbox, and close it with hands that fumbled from exhaustion and fear. Someone was here. Someone had seen her, or heard her, or simply noticed that the door to the abandoned house at the end of Ridgeway Avenue was standing open when it should have been sealed. An elderly man appeared in the doorway, silhouetted against the morning light, 70-something with weathered face and white hair and eyes that widened when they found her sitting among the ruins of her former life. Margot? The name came out uncertain, questioning, like he couldn't quite believe what he was seeing. Margot Thorne? Good Lord, is that really you? She didn't know whether to run or fight or simply sit here and wait for whatever came next. Her body had no running left in it. Fighting seemed equally futile. Sitting meant surrender, but also meant conserving energy she didn't have to spare. Who are you? Her voice came out harder than she intended, defensive in ways 3 decades of institutional life had taught her to be. The man took a step into the room, hands visible and empty, posture non-threatening in ways that suggested he understood she had reason to be afraid. It's me, Wallace Brenner. Wally. I live next door. Worked with Henry at the mill. I haven't seen you since his funeral. We all thought you were... your kids said you were... sick? Margot's laugh was bitter. Crazy? Committed to Pinecrest because I was too grief-stricken to function? Is that what they told you? Wally's face did something complicated, expressions moving across it too quickly for Margot to parse. That's what they said. That's what Dr. Pembroke confirmed, that you needed long-term care, that visiting you would just upset you more, that the family needed space to process everything without outsiders interfering. They lied. The words came out flat, exhausted, but carrying weight that couldn't be denied. They bribed Dr. Pembroke to commit me so they could take this house. I was never mentally ill. I was inconvenient. She held up the letter, the damning piece of paper that contained proof in black and white. Wally crossed the room, took it from her with hands that shook slightly, read it with eyes that moved faster as he processed what he was seeing. When he looked up, his face had gone pale. Those bastards. His voice was quiet but carried fury that matched Margot's own. Those absolute bastards. Margot, I'm sorry. I should have questioned it. Henry talked about you every day while he was sick. Talked about how much he loved you, how much you meant to him. It didn't make sense that you just fall apart after he died. But your kids seemed so certain, and Dr. Pembroke had credentials, and I was a coward who didn't want to believe people could do something that monstrous to their own mother. Margot took the letter back, held it against her chest like armor. I don't need your apology. I need help. Do you know if Marcus and Vivian still live in Millbrook? Wally shook his head. Marcus moved away years ago. Gambling debts caught up with him, from what I heard. Lives somewhere in California now, if he's still alive. But Vivian's still here. Married to Douglas Ashford, the city councilman. Big house on the hill. They've done well for themselves. Of course they have. Built their success on my captivity. On property they tried to steal. On money they saved by not having to support an inconvenient mother. Where is this house they built? Wally's expression suggested he understood where this was going and wasn't sure he should help it get there. Margot, you need to be careful. Douglas Ashford is powerful, connected. He's been trying to acquire this property for years, says it's the last piece he needs for some development project. If he finds out you're back, if he realizes you're going to fight for the deed, let him find out. Margot's voice was steady despite the exhaustion pulling at her. Let him try to stop me. I survived 32 years in Pinecrest. I can survive Douglas Ashford. You don't understand. Wally's voice carried urgency that made Margot pay attention despite herself. Ashford owns half the police force. He's got the building inspector in his pocket, the mayor, probably the judges too. If he wants you committed again, he'll find a doctor who'll sign the papers. If he wants this house condemned, he'll make it happen. You can't fight this alone. Then help me. Margot met his eyes, held his gaze with intensity born of 3 decades, watching people for signs of honesty or deception. You said you owe Henry. You said you should have questioned what happened. Help me now. Help me finish what he started. Wally was silent for a long moment, weighing options Margot couldn't see, calculating risks she didn't have the information to understand. Finally, he nodded, decision made. Okay, but first you need somewhere safe. This house isn't habitable, and if anyone sees you here, they'll call it trespassing, use it against you. My place is next door. You can clean up, rest, figure out next steps. The sound of vehicles outside cut through whatever Margot might have said next. Multiple engines, truck sounds, official in the way institutional vehicles always sounded. Wally crossed to the window, looked out, and his face told Margot everything she needed to know about what he saw. It's Ashford. He's got the building inspector with him and what looks like police. They're posting condemnation signs. Already? How could he possibly know I'm here? Wally's expression was grim. Small town, Margot. Someone saw you or saw me coming over here. Word travels fast, especially when it's about the crazy woman everyone thought was locked up safe, coming back to the house that's been sitting empty for 3 decades. Margot grabbed the lockbox, held it against her chest like the treasure it was. Then let's go out there. Let's make it official. Margot, you should hide. If they see you, if they see me, they see me. She was moving toward the front door despite Wally's protests, despite exhaustion and injury, and every reasonable voice in her head that said this was foolish. I'm done hiding. I'm done being invisible. This is my house, and I'm not letting them take it without a fight. She emerged onto the collapsed porch into morning light that hurt her eyes after 3 decades of institutional fluorescence. There were 3 trucks parked in the overgrown driveway, municipal vehicles with official seals. A man in an expensive suit stood beside them, 50-something with the kind of face that had learned early how to smile while calculating, how to project concern while planning conquest. Douglas Ashford had to be, with his politician's hair and his developer's eyes and his posture that said he owned everything his gaze touched. Beside him was another man, 60s maybe, carrying a clipboard and wearing the bureaucratic resignation of someone who had stopped questioning orders years ago. The building inspector, doing work he probably knew was wrong, but had been paid or pressured into accepting. 2 police officers stood slightly apart, young guys who looked uncomfortable with whatever was happening here, but not uncomfortable enough to refuse participation. Ashford was the first to see her, and his expression did something interesting when he did. Surprise, yes, but also calculation, adjusting plans on the fly to account for variables he hadn't expected to encounter. Mrs. Thorne? His voice carried exactly the right notes of concern and confusion. My God, Vivian told me you were at Pinecrest. Does your family know you're here? You shouldn't be in this building, it's not safe. The structure is compromised, could collapse at any moment. This is my house. Margot's voice was steady despite shaking that threatened to take her legs out from under her. My name is on the deed. You have no right to condemn it. Ashford exchanged glances with the building inspector, some communication passing between them that needed no words. Mrs. Thorne, I understand you're confused. You've been away for a long time, but this property has been abandoned for 32 years. It's a hazard, a danger to the neighborhood. I'm afraid we have no choice but to condemn it and schedule it for demolition. Demolition? Her laugh was sharp enough to cut. So you can build your development? So you can finally take the land you and my children planned to steal 3 decades ago? Now Ashford's expression shifted to something that might have been genuine concern if Margot hadn't seen the calculation underneath it. Mrs. Thorne, I think you need help. Medical help. Officer, I believe this woman has left a psychiatric facility without authorization. For her own safety, perhaps we should... A car door slammed, cutting through whatever Ashford had been about to say. Another vehicle had arrived, this one small and slightly battered, driven by a young woman who emerged with laptop bag and phone already in hand, eyes taking in the scene with the kind of hunger that suggested she knew a story when she saw one. Don't touch her. The woman's voice carried authority that seemed disproportionate to her age. I'm Nora Whitmore, Millbrook Gazette. I've been investigating Pinecrest Psychiatric Hospital for 5 years, and I'd very much like to hear what Mrs. Thorne has to say before anyone decides she needs to be committed again. Ashford's face did something careful, politician's instincts warring with whatever his original plan had been. This is a private matter, Ms. Whitmore. I'm sure Mrs. Thorne's family would appreciate some discretion while they handle this difficult situation. Nora ignored him completely, focused entirely on Margot with intensity that suggested recognition of something important. Mrs. Thorne, if you want to tell your story, I'll make sure people hear it. Every word, documented and published where it can't be buried again. Margot looked at this young woman who had appeared like intervention or accident or possibly the first piece of luck she'd had in 32 years. She looked at Ashford and his inspector and his police officers and his condemnation signs. She looked at Wally standing beside her, this man who had failed Henry once but seemed determined not to fail again. She looked at the house behind her, ruined but still standing, still hers, still possible despite everything that had tried to destroy it. And she understood that this moment, right here, was the fulcrum where everything would either begin or end, where she either disappeared back into silence or claimed her voice in ways that couldn't be ignored. My name is Margot Ann Thorne. Her voice carried across the yard, across the years, across every attempt to silence her. I am 74 years old. I was illegally committed to Pinecrest Psychiatric Hospital 32 years ago by my children, who bribed a doctor named Sheffield Pembroke to diagnose me as mentally ill so they could steal this property. I have proof, and I want everyone to know what they did. Nora Whitmore recorded everything. Her phone captured Margot's declaration, captured Ashford's face as it shifted through calculations, visible enough that even the police officers seemed to notice something was wrong with the scene they'd been called to manage. The journalist's questions came fast and precise, years of investigation giving her framework for exactly what to ask and how to ask it in ways that produced answers nobody could later claim were taken out of context. When was the last time you saw your children? What exactly did Dr. Pembroke tell you during your evaluation? Who signed the commitment papers? Did anyone explain your legal rights? Did you ever receive copies of the documentation used to justify your detention? Margot answered each question with the kind of detail that 3 decades of having nothing to do but remember had burned into memory with perfect clarity. Dates and times and specific phrases spoken by people who had assumed she would never be in position to repeat them. The recording ran for 17 minutes before Ashford interrupted, with voice that suggested he understood damage control was no longer possible, but felt obligated to try anyway. This is clearly a woman in distress who needs medical evaluation rather than interrogation by press. Officers, I really must insist that we prioritize Mrs. Thorne's welfare over... I have documentation. Margot pulled Dr. Pembroke's letter from the lockbox still clutched against her chest, held it up where Nora's phone camera could capture both the letterhead and Ashford's expression as he recognized what he was seeing. A letter from Dr. Sheffield Pembroke to my son Marcus, dated 2 weeks before my commitment, discussing the fee he would receive for diagnosing me as mentally ill, despite knowing I didn't meet criteria for involuntary hospitalization. Nora's eyes went wide in ways that suggested she had been investigating Pinecrest for years, but never expected to get evidence this direct, this damning, this impossible to explain away. May I photograph that? Photograph it, copy it, publish it. Margot's voice was steady despite exhaustion threatening to drag her down into darkness. Make sure everyone knows what they did. Make sure they can never do it to anyone else. The building inspector was already backing toward his truck, clipboard forgotten, clearly deciding that whatever he'd been paid or promised to condemn this property wasn't worth being documented as part of conspiracy that was unfolding in real time. The police officers exchanged glances that suggested they were having similar calculations about whether standing here made them accessories to something they didn't want attached to their names. Ashford's politician instincts kicked in with impressive speed. Mrs. Thorne, I can see you've been through something terrible. If what you're saying is true, if there was misconduct by Dr. Pembroke or anyone else, then that needs to be investigated properly through appropriate channels. But you must understand that this property genuinely is unsafe. The structure has deteriorated beyond. Then I'll fix it. Wally stepped forward, positioning himself beside Margot in ways that made clear he wasn't just neighbor, but ally. I'm a carpenter, worked with Henry Thorne for 30 years. I know this house was built to last, and I know what it needs to be made safe again. Mrs. Thorne has every right to restore her own property. You can't just decide to renovate a condemned building. There are permits, inspections, regulations, then file whatever paperwork is required. Margot met Ashford's eyes with gaze that had learned not to blink during 32 years of being watched for signs of weakness. But understand this, Councilman. I'm not leaving. This is my house. It's been my house since 1950, when Henry and I bought this land for $800 and built these walls with our own hands. Your wife and her brother tried to steal it by having me locked away. That didn't work then, and it's not going to work now. Ashford's expression suggested he was reassessing everything he thought he knew about this situation, recalculating odds in real time as variables shifted faster than he could control. Vivian never told me about any bribe. If Dr. Pembroke acted improperly, that's between him and the medical board. My interest in this property is purely professional. The development I'm planning would benefit the entire community. By demolishing my home and building whatever makes you the most profit? Margot's laugh was sharp. I don't think so. Mrs. Thorne, be reasonable. You're 74 years old. You've been institutionalized for 3 decades. You can't possibly think you can restore a house in this condition on your own. Watch me. The words came out with finality that surprised even Margot herself. Watch me do exactly that. Nora was still recording, still photographing Dr. Pembroke's letter from multiple angles, still asking questions that Ashford was refusing to answer as he retreated toward his vehicle, with police officers who seemed eager to be elsewhere. The building inspector's truck was already pulling away, condemnation signs left leaning against what remained of the porch, like abandoned props from a play that had veered off script. When the last vehicle disappeared down Ridgeway Avenue, Margot let herself sag against Wally's arm. Let exhaustion she'd been fighting claim territory in muscles and bones that had nothing left to give. The lockbox slipped from her grasp, but Wally caught it before it hit the ground, steadied her before she followed it down. Easy. His voice was gentle in ways that made something crack inside Margot's chest. When's the last time you slept? 8. That scratch on your back needs cleaning before infection sets in. Let's get you next door. Let's take care of the immediate crisis before we plan how to win the war. The story broke 3 days later with force that exceeded even Nora's predictions. Front page of the Millbrook Gazette, picked up by Portland papers by noon, regional news by evening, trending nationally by the next morning. Margot's face stared out from screens and newspapers across the country. A photo Nora had captured showing her standing in front of the ruined house with expression that conveyed determination more than defeat. Camera crews descended on Ridgeway Avenue. Reporters shouted questions while Margot worked, clearing debris and repairing damage and bringing structure back to code, one board at a time. The attention was exhausting, but served the purpose Nora had predicted. Every camera, every article, every social media post made Margot harder to quietly disappear again. Gideon Hartwell filed motions that bought her 90 days to prove the house could be restored. The judge denied Ashford's condemnation, with ruling that made clear he saw through the pretextual nature of the attempt. Building inspectors came weekly, documenting progress that surprised them, structural repairs that exceeded code requirements, work that proved an elderly woman and a retired carpenter could accomplish what bureaucrats had declared impossible. The basement became habitable first, then the first floor, then slowly the second. Margot worked 16-hour days despite Wally's protests, driven by understanding that stopping meant time to think, and thinking meant time to doubt. Her body screamed protests that she ignored because pain meant she was alive, meant she was free, meant she was reclaiming what had been stolen, one nail at a time. 3 weeks after the story broke, Gideon arrived with news that carried complexity Margot wasn't prepared for. Your daughter wants to meet. Not both children, just Vivian. Marcus is apparently somewhere in California and not responding to attempts at contact. But Vivian's lawyer reached out, says she wants to talk. No lawyers present, just you and her. The idea of seeing Vivian made something cold settle in Margot's chest. But she heard herself agreeing because justice required more than her own vindication. Tell her yes, tomorrow, here, and I want Nora recording everything. Vivian arrived exactly on time, a woman of 68 who had aged into polished elegance money could buy, silver hair professionally styled, expensive clothes that looked effortless in ways that required significant effort. But when she saw Margot, something in her expression cracked just long enough for Nora's cameras to capture genuine shock or recognition of exactly how badly this was going to go. Mother. The word came out stiff, formal, like addressing stranger rather than woman who had carried and birthed and raised her. Vivian. Margot didn't stand from where she sat on a workbench, didn't offer embrace or handshake, or any of the social niceties that might suggest forgiveness was on offer. You wanted to talk, so talk. I didn't know. Vivian's voice carried the particular tone of someone who had rehearsed this speech, but found it inadequate when faced with actual audience. I mean, I knew Marcus was planning something, but I didn't understand the extent of it until it was too late to stop. You were there. Margot's voice was flat. You testified at my evaluation. You told Dr. Pembroke I was paranoid, confused, dangerous. You looked me in the eyes and lied to put me in that place. Marcus said you were falling apart, that the grief was destroying you, that if we didn't intervene, you'd lose everything Dad worked for. He made it sound like we were helping. And the money? The $50,000 paid to Dr. Pembroke? Was that helping too? Vivian's composure wavered. I didn't know about that until years later. Marcus handled everything with Pembroke. I just thought we were getting you treatment you needed. But you never visited. Margot stood now, crossing to where Vivian stood frozen. Not once in 32 years. If you really believed I needed help, why didn't you come see how I was doing? Why didn't you check on the mother you claimed to care about? Because I couldn't face you. Vivian's voice broke. Because every time I thought about visiting, I remembered your face that last time we came, when you refused to sign the papers. You looked at me like you knew exactly what we were doing, and I couldn't handle that. So I told myself you were too sick to remember. That visits would just upset you, that staying away was kinder. Kinder for who? For me, locked in that place for 3 decades? Or for you, living in your big house with my husband's money, building your life on the foundation of my suffering? Both. The honesty in Vivian's voice was unexpected. For both of us. I'm not asking for forgiveness, Mother. I don't deserve it. But I need you to know that I've lived with what I did every single day. That there hasn't been a morning in 32 years when I woke up and didn't think about you in that place. Good. Margot's voice carried no satisfaction, just exhaustion with conversation that changed nothing. You should think about it. You should wake up every day and remember that you chose money over your own mother, that you let Marcus convince you to destroy the woman who gave you life because it was easier than standing up to him. There's something else you need to know. Vivian pulled an envelope from her purse with hands that shook slightly. Marcus had a son, your grandson Thomas. He died last year in a car accident. He left a daughter, Lily. She's 9 years old. She's been in foster care since Thomas died because Marcus refused to take her, and I didn't know if I had the right to claim her after what I did to you. The room tilted slightly. Margot gripped the workbench to steady herself against information that rewrote everything she understood about what she'd lost. A grandson she'd never known about. A great-granddaughter who existed somewhere without any idea her great-grandmother was alive and free and fighting to reclaim what was stolen. Where is she? With a foster family in Portland. Thomas told her about you before he died. Told her his grandmother was the strongest person he'd ever known, that she was a carpenter who could fix anything. Marcus told him you were too sick to see, but Thomas never believed it. He tried to find you once, but Pinecrest wouldn't confirm you were there, said they couldn't release information about patients. Vivian held out the envelope. This is everything I have about Lily. Foster family contact information, court documents, Thomas's will naming you as guardian if you were ever found competent. He believed in you even when I didn't. Margot took the envelope with hands that trembled. A 9-year-old girl, family she didn't know existed, future she hadn't allowed herself to imagine. Get out. Her voice was quiet but carried weight that couldn't be misunderstood. Get out of my house and don't come back. If I decide to pursue custody of Lily, you'll hear from my lawyer. But I don't want to see you again. Mother, you lost the right to call me that 32 years ago. Margot turned her back, focusing on the envelope in her hands rather than the daughter who had betrayed her. Tell your husband that if he tries to condemn this house again, I'll make sure every newspaper in the country knows exactly what role he played in keeping me locked away. Now leave. Vivian left without another word, shoulders carrying defeat in ways that might have satisfied Margot if she'd had energy left for satisfaction. Instead, she opened the envelope and found photographs of a small girl with dark curly hair and gray eyes that looked eerily like Margot's own, had been before Pinecrest turned them older. Found documents showing Thomas had been fighting for years to get information about his grandmother, that he'd filed petitions and made complaints, and refused to accept the family story about mental illness. Found a letter he'd written to Lily before he died. My darling girl, if you're reading this, it means I'm gone, and you're old enough to understand what I need to tell you. Your great-grandmother Margot is alive somewhere. Uncle Marcus says she's sick and can't see visitors, but I don't believe him. I think something wrong happened a long time ago, something nobody wants to talk about. If you ever get the chance to find her, please do. Tell her I never stopped believing in her. Tell her Thomas's son remembered everything she taught him about fixing what's broken. Margot sat on the basement floor holding the letter and understanding that Henry's legacy hadn't ended with his death or her imprisonment. It had continued through a grandson who believed in her without ever meeting her, who passed that belief to a daughter who needed someone to believe in now that he was gone. The custody hearing happened 6 weeks later in a Portland courtroom that smelled like old wood and institutional disinfectant. The foster family who'd been caring for Lily sat on one side, kind-faced people who clearly loved the girl but understood they weren't her family. Vivian's lawyer sat on the other side, representing interests that weren't entirely clear but seemed aimed at preventing Margot from gaining custody, despite the evidence that Vivian herself had provided. Margot testified about her commitment, about the bribe, about 32 years stolen by children who wanted property more than they wanted their mother. She testified about the house she was restoring, about the life she was rebuilding, about the capacity she still had to love and protect despite everything that had tried to break her. The judge was a woman in her 50s who listened with attention that suggested she understood the weight of what she was deciding. Mrs. Thorne, I've reviewed the documentation regarding your commitment to Pinecrest. The circumstances were clearly irregular. Dr. Pembroke is currently under investigation by the medical board, and criminal charges may follow. However, my concern isn't with the past, but with the present. Are you truly capable of providing stable home for a 9-year-old child? Before Margot could answer, the courtroom door opened, and a small figure slipped inside. Lily, escaping from wherever the bailiff had told her to wait, moving with determination that suggested she'd inherited more than just Margot's eyes. She crossed directly to where Margot sat and climbed into the chair beside her with complete disregard for courtroom protocol. "Are you Grandma Margot?" Her voice was clear and carrying, designed to reach the judge without trying. "Daddy said you were strong and brave and could fix anything. He said if I ever found you, I should hold on tight and never let go." The judge's expression did something complicated. "Young lady, you're supposed to wait outside until—" "I've been waiting my whole life." Lily's hand found Margot's with grip that felt like claiming rather than asking. "I don't want to wait anymore." Margot looked at this child who carried Thomas's features and Henry's spirit, and her own stubborn refusal to accept what others declared impossible. She looked at the judge who held power to either unite or separate them. She looked at Vivian's lawyer who was trying to formulate objection to something that had already happened in ways that transcended legal process. "Your Honor, if I may." Margot's voice was steady. "I understand your concerns about my capability. I'm 74 years old. I was institutionalized for 3 decades. I'm currently living in a house that's still being restored. By conventional measures, I'm probably not ideal guardian, but I'm the only family this child has who actually wants her, who believes she deserves better than foster care or relatives who view her as inconvenience. And I spent 32 years learning exactly how much a person can survive when they have reason to keep fighting. Lily is that reason now." The judge was silent for a long moment, studying Margot and Lily with expression that suggested she was weighing factors that had nothing to do with legal standards and everything to do with understanding what family actually meant. "I'm going to grant temporary custody with review in 6 months. Mrs. Thorne, you'll have weekly check-ins with social services, and the house will need to pass full safety inspection before Lily can live there full-time. But I think sometimes the legal standard and the right thing aren't the same, and I think this might be one of those times." Lily's grip on Margot's hand tightened to a point of pain that felt like the opposite of suffering, like proof that connection could hurt in ways that healed rather than destroyed. Margot lifted the child's hand and pressed it against her chest, where her heart was beating faster than it had in 3 decades. "Thank you, Your Honor." The words were inadequate, but they were all she had. The house passed inspection 3 months later, with commendations from the same building department that had tried to condemn it. Every room restored not just to code, but beyond it, incorporating modern safety features into historical structure in ways that honored Henry's original vision while acknowledging the decades that had passed. Wally had helped with the heavy work, but Margot had insisted on doing the finished carpentry herself. Joints fitted so tight paper couldn't slide between them, the way Henry had taught her back when they were young, in building their life with nothing but love and lumber. Lily moved in on a Tuesday afternoon in late spring, carrying a duffel bag that contained everything she owned, and wearing expression that mixed hope with fear in ways Margot recognized from mirrors. The child explored every room with reverence appropriate for spaces that represented more than shelter, that carried history and sacrifice, and the kind of love that endured beyond death. This was Grandpa Henry's workshop? Lily stood in the basement where tools hung on pegboard, exactly as Henry had arranged them, where workbench still bore scars from decades of creation. Daddy told me about him, said he could make anything from wood in memory. He could. Margot handed Lily a small jewelry box Henry had made for her before Marcus was born. Dovetail joints visible at corners, wood so perfectly fitted it had survived 7 decades without coming apart. This was the first thing he built after we bought this land. He said if he could make something this delicate without destroying it, he could probably handle building a whole house. Can you teach me? Lily's fingers traced the joints with touch that suggested she understood craftsmanship wasn't just about skill, but about caring enough to do things right. Can you teach me to build things like this? Yes, Margot's voice caught on the word, but held steady. That's exactly what I'm going to teach you. They fell into routines that felt both strange and natural. Grandmother and great-granddaughter learning each other through the ordinary moments that constituted life, beyond institutions and foster care, and all the ways the system tried to categorize people who didn't fit convenient boxes. Breakfast at the table. Henry had built from oak that grew on this property. Afternoons in the workshop, learning to measure twice and cut once, to respect wood's grain, to understand that patience was skill as important as any other. Evenings on the porch Henry had restored, and Margot had rebuilt, watching fireflies and talking about everything and nothing. Lily asked questions, Margot answered with honesty that sometimes hurt, but never lied. What was it like in that place? Why did they lock you up? Are you angry at Aunt Vivian? Do you miss Grandpa Henry? Yes to all of it. Angry and sad and missing and surviving and learning that all of those could exist simultaneously without canceling each other out. Nora's investigation expanded beyond Margot's story to encompass the 11 other cases she'd identified, the 7 dead and the 3 too damaged to speak, and the one still locked away in catatonic state that might have been medical condition or might have been the only way to survive what had been done to her. The medical board revoked Dr. Pembroke's license posthumously after he died 2 months into the investigation. Heart attack that some people call justice and others called escape from accountability he deserved to face while living. Marcus was found in San Diego, living under assumed name, arrested on fraud charges unrelated to Margot's commitment, but suggesting pattern of behavior that made clear he'd been running from consequences most of his life. He was extradited to Oregon to face charges of conspiracy and fraud related to the commitment. Trial scheduled for fall, with Margot listed as primary witness. Vivian separated from Ashford 3 months after their meeting in the basement, moved to a smaller house on the other side of town, took a job at a non-profit helping families navigate elder care, in ways that suggested she understood penance was action rather than apology. She sent cards on Lily's birthday and Christmas, never asking to visit, but maintaining presence at periphery in ways that said she understood her role had been forfeited, but not entirely erased. Ashford's development project collapsed when investors learned about his connection to Margot's case. When publicity made clear that proceeding would attach their names to story about corruption and greed and institutional abuse. The land he'd already acquired sat empty, monument to ambition that had outpaced ethics. The house on Ridgeway Avenue became something more than private residence. Margot offered the restored basement as meeting space for support group Nora had started, survivors of psychiatric abuse gathering weekly to share stories that had been silenced too long. 12 regular members who had been committed under questionable circumstances, who had lost years to institutions that profited from their captivity, who were learning that speaking truth in community was its own kind of healing. On the first anniversary of her escape, Margot stood in the living room she had rebuilt and looked at the photograph she'd placed on the mantel above the fireplace Henry had constructed. Their wedding photo from 1950, young and hopeful and completely unaware of what the future held, dressed in their best clothes standing in front of the courthouse, making promises they kept, even when keeping them meant building insurance against children who would betray those promises. Lily appeared beside her, 9 years old and growing into features that mixed Margot's stubbornness with Henry's craftsmanship and something entirely her own. Do you think Grandpa Henry would be proud of us? I think he'd be proud we used what he left us. Not just the evidence, but the example. He spent his last months protecting me, even though he wouldn't be here to see whether it was enough. We're spending our time building something that honors that protection. What are we building? A life. Margot's arm went around Lily's shoulders, pulling her close in ways that felt like claiming and being claimed simultaneously. One where we get to decide what we become instead of letting other people decide for us. One where we fix what's broken and make it stronger than it was before. One where we remember that the best inheritance isn't money or property, but the courage to fight for what's right, even when everything is stacked against you. That sounds hard. It is hard. Margot looked at Henry's photograph, at the young man who had loved her enough to prepare for betrayal he hoped wouldn't come, who had trusted she would survive long enough to use what he built. But everything worth doing is hard. And we're thorns and heartwells and survivors of things that should have destroyed us, but didn't. Hard is what we do. Through the window, Margot could see Wally working in his garden next door, could see Nora's car pulling up with another former patient who had finally found courage to share their story, could see the street that had been her home and her loss, and was now her home again in ways that meant more than property ever could. 32 years stolen, but not wasted because she had learned what people could survive when they held on to who they were underneath what the system tried to make them. Had learned that visibility was protection and silence was surrender. And the space between impossible and achieved was often just the distance of refusing to give up. She thought about Marcus in custody awaiting trial, about Vivian in her smaller house trying to earn forgiveness Margot might never grant, about Dr. Pembroke dead before facing full consequences, but exposed before dying in ways that stripped away the respectability he'd hidden behind. She thought about Ashford and his collapsed project, and the politicians who'd enabled system that ate vulnerable people and called it healthcare. Justice wasn't what she'd imagined it would be when she escaped. It wasn't neat or complete or entirely satisfying. Marcus would likely get a few years at most. Vivian would never serve time because she'd provided evidence that helped prosecute others. Ashford would face civil suits, but probably avoid criminal charges because his name appeared on none of the documents that mattered. Dr. Pembroke was beyond earthly justice entirely. But justice wasn't just about punishment. It was about the 11 families Nora had found who were getting compensation for what was stolen. It was about the legislative hearings Margot had testified at, pushing for reforms that would make it harder to commit people without proper review. It was about the patients still in Pinecrest and facilities like it, who now had advocates checking on them, making sure their commitments were legitimate, giving them voices the system had tried to silence. It was about a 9-year-old girl who would grow up knowing her great-grandmother had fought the system and won, who would carry that knowledge into whatever battles she faced in her own life, who would understand that courage was often just refusing to let others define your reality. Lily tugged on Margot's hand. "Grandma, can we work on the treehouse today? You promised we'd finish the railing." "Yes." Margot turned from the window in the past it represented toward the child, in the future she embodied. "Let's go build something that lasts." They went to the workshop where Henry's tools waited, where wood carried memory of hands that had shaped it decades ago, and hands that would shape it for decades to come, where a 75-year-old woman and a 9-year-old girl could create structures that transcended simple carpentry to become proof that what was broken could be rebuilt, that what was lost could be reclaimed, that love persisted across death and time and every attempt to destroy it. Margot picked up Henry's favorite hammer, worn smooth by decades of use, and felt his presence not as ghost, but as continuation. She was his legacy the way Lily was hers, each generation building on what came before, using tools and knowledge and courage passed down through family lines that valued craft over speed, truth over convenience, doing things right over doing things easy. Outside, afternoon sun illuminated yard that had been wilderness and was now garden again, house that had been corpse and was now home again. life that had been stolen and was now reclaimed in ways that meant more than simple restoration. The work continued because work always continued for people who understood that creation was resistance, that building was healing, that the opposite of institutional control wasn't chaos, but the deliberate choice to make something beautiful from what others had tried to destroy. And in the living room, on the mantel above fireplace that Henry built and Margot rebuilt, the wedding photograph watched over everything with reminder that some promises transcended circumstance, that some love survived being tested in ways no love should have to survive, that the truest inheritance was teaching the next generation that they were strong enough to fight for themselves when the time came to do so. Margot Ann Thorne had been locked away for 32 years by children who chose money over mother, by systems that valued convenience over justice, by people who believed vulnerability could be exploited without consequence. But she had survived by holding on to the essential truth of who she was, underneath every attempt to convince her she was someone else. And now, with hammer in hand and great-granddaughter beside her, and house she'd rebuilt standing as proof that even things that looked dead could be brought back to life, she was teaching that same lesson to the next generation. You are who you know yourself to be, not who others try to make you. And that knowledge, held tight enough and long enough and fierce enough, is armor that no institution can penetrate, no betrayal can destroy, no amount of time can erode into something less than truth.